Sophie now is going to bring us home to impending underwater experiences in Boston and Cambridge, where we're going to turn Boston Common into Boston Common Harbor.
Yeah, impending doom.
Let me see. Let me show you people what you look like first. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about what Cambridge will look like in 2100 from sea level rise. So a very different Cambridge than the one that everyone knows today, unfortunately. So first we have to consider the elevation of Boston and Cambridge. So Boston is a coastal city, as is Cambridge, a little more inland because of the rivers, but still a coastal city. So the average elevation of Boston is 14 meters or 46 feet, but if you can see from this elevation map here, this blue part show how close it is to sea level. Boston is just obviously really close to sea level, meaning that it will be very directly affected from sea level rise. And then if we look down here, this is a flood risk map for the cities of Boston and Cambridge. So as I'm sure everyone experiences, when you have large amounts of rain, extreme weather, like hurricanes, our basements can flood, the areas that are really close to bodies of water can flood, and these flood risks will only increase with sea level rise, regardless of whether or not they're directly connected to a body of water that's connected to the ocean. So that's not something people will always think about because they'll think sea level rise is only related to the ocean, but actually sea level rise will also affect these hydrologically unconnected bodies of water like lakes and ponds because of groundwater as well.
Because water goes downhill, so if
Yeah,
there's
water
any
goes
kind
downhill,
of
yeah.
space between the buildings, it'll just flow down there.
Yeah,
when it's
exactly.
higher coming over the wharf and stuff.
Yeah.
Can we hold that a second? So how do we read that left graph? It looks like the maroon is going to be the lowest places, and then
Yeah, so the maroon is where you have the most extreme levels of flooding.
so I'm seeing in the lower right there, it's like Hull coming up from
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's all dark because that's like Nantasket Beach is going to be underwater. And
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. So those are areas that, like, even just in high tide, they can have flooding.
And so those dark spots are like low spots.
Exactly.
And so if you're in a dark spot, then hang on to your life jacket or something.
Yeah, just any area of lower elevation generally will have to worry about flood risks.
Interesting.
So when we think of sea level rise, sometimes, you know, with climate change, people wonder, like, what's the big deal? Like, does it actually matter? It's so far away. But sea level rise means a lot for the cities of Boston and Cambridge. So these are just some news articles. This one is from the Boston Globe. This one's from WBUR. This one's actually from the Washington Post.
Can you read us the titles in case people can't read them?
Yeah, so the one from the Boston Globe is, here's what rising sea levels mean for Boston. WBUR is the 1, 2, 3s of Boston's rising sea levels. And then from the Washington Post, which is not local to Boston really at all, is Boston Harbor brings ashore a new enemy, rising seas. And this one is from the Harvard Crimson, so Harvard's newspaper, that says God only knows as sea level rise threatens Harvard and Greater Boston and threatens the Harvard and Greater Boston area. Experts mull mitigation strategies. So if you're a student or administrator at Harvard, you should be worried about sea level rise because this picture that they have over here is sort of a rough picture. They don't really give any numbers for how they constructed this picture, but it's just essentially what Cambridge could look like with sea level rise. So if you see here, this is the Charles River, but this is a body of water that's completely new, which is just flooding from sea level rise in lower Alston. So all of these lower elevation areas of Alston could be underwater depending on our different projections that we have for sea level rise, which we'll get into it, but there's a lot of varying predictions. So this is the relative sea level trend in Boston, Massachusetts, and what we can see from this graph from 1920 to 2020 is a very distinct increase in sea level rise that is not explained only by high tide and low tide trends. So these extreme up and downs are just tides. And what's important to consider about sea level rise is that there's two reasons and two factors that come into play with sea level rise. The first is what most people picture, which is the melting ice caps. Those like extreme photos of just massive chunks of ice falling off of Antarctica and like the Arctic Circle. And that makes the most sense because you're just adding massive water into the ocean. So obviously that's going to rise sea levels and like increase the just height of the sea. But the other thing to consider that people don't think about as much because it's not so obvious is that warm water takes up more space than cold water because as water warms up, it expands. So we don't just have to consider that when all the ice caps melt, we'll hit like kind of a cap. There's just no real way of telling what the exact sea level rise will be and the rate of sea level rise. So depending on greenhouse gas emissions and how hot the world becomes and how hot the oceans become and how much ice melts, we could have really varying degrees of rates of sea level rise.
Yeah, hold on, let's go back to that. That's a cool graph. Because, 2% of the world's waters, 2%, so like 96% of the water in the world is in our oceans.
Yeah.
And 2% is locked up in ice.
Yeah.
And so in 100 years, or by the end of the century, we might be down to 1% ice.
Yeah.
But, it's that heating, we've got to bring down the heating because that's what's causing most of the sea level rise. And that's why that's causing a lot of it. And it's something we can control more than we can, it's all controlled by heating. And now the spikes here, what we're seeing is that twice a year we have spring tides, and spring tides means that the Earth is tipped closer toward the moon than during the other seasons, and so that causes the waters to rise higher and go lower, and so that's why you see like 2 peaks every 2 years. It's hard to count the peaks between for a 10-year stretch there, but you see about 20 peaks, and so that's it's crazy. And then sometimes the wind's blowing, the tide's not as great if it's against it, or if it's so it's difficult to accurately say, and when you're standing on Long Wharf, you want to know, is it going to be 3 inches over or 4 inches over, and you just can't tell. So you just got to put the sandbags up around the Blue Line station and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly, which is why it's hard to measure rates of sea level rise within short periods of time because of these just like variations that naturally occur in tidal variations.
Right, because we're here in the Gulf of Maine, from Cape Cod to Nova Scotia is an enclosed gulf with water, and it's closed off from the open ocean by George's Banks and Brown's Banks. I guess it's up here or something. And so we've got this big like basin, and that's why the tide is so high in Bay of Fundy. Is because the way it sloshes, it happens to slosh 8 feet here and 36 feet over there. This Minas Basin, which is this enclosed bit of water at the head of the Bay of Fundy, they thought about putting a hydroelectric dam there a tidal dam that would grab so it would fill up and then the tide would go out and then it would turn generators letting the water out. And they discovered if they put that dam across there, it would change sea level rise in Boston by a few inches because they're mixing with that whole system again. So just like Zeke was saying earlier, these systems are all interconnected and it's really hard to tell what we can do. But if we can just minimize extreme weather conditions by reducing our greenhouse gases, that's going to get us in the right direction.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. And that's where you get these prediction variations. So for 2100, there's 4 different levels that scientists predict, which is the intermediate low, intermediate high, and high. And the low is as low as 2.5 feet, and the high is as high as around 6.5 feet. And the reason that we get these variations is because we don't know what our future emissions will look like. So depending on what governments decide to do, what international agreements we come to, it will have a massive impact on sea level rise, specifically in Boston. But also, it's important to remember that greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for quite some time. So even if we decide to stop our emissions completely at say 2070, there still will be those concentrations of greenhouse gases until like maybe 2090. And those things will still heat up the globe. So it's not, you know, oh, we can lower our emissions 30 years in the future and we'll be fine.
It's not like a faucet, you can just turn it off.
Yeah, no.
No, because it's still going to be swelling with heat.
Yeah, it's really like this lower prediction variation is really like assuming that we stop most emissions very soon. And as you can see, this is the bottom prediction variation is the most linear. The rest of them grow exponentially, obviously in accordance with these feedback loops that we see with rising sea levels. Specifically, the ice caps melt in a feedback loop, which basically means that the more they melt, the faster they melt. Because when you think of anything with a white surface, it reflects a lot of sunlight. You know, when you wear a white shirt on a summer day, it will reflect more sunlight, as opposed to if you wear a black shirt, you'll get really hot because it absorbs a lot of the sunlight. So when the ice caps melt, they go into the ocean, and the ocean absorbs a significantly larger amount of heat as compared to ice, because ice is white, the ocean's much darker blue, depending on where you are, but wherever you are, it absorbs more and reflects less than ice. So when ice melts, it goes into the ocean that has that absorbs this heat and then melts the ice even faster. So that also has to do with what rate we'll see for sea level rise. But again, we're just not sure because we don't know what our emissions will be. We don't know how quickly the ice will melt.
Right, but the albedo effect of taking the sunlight in, it is greater when it's sunny out, and when it's cloudy, it isn't so great.
Yeah, exactly.
So the cloud formation varies minute by minute, you know,
Yeah.
so you can't just run these 100-year scenarios, because
No,
the variables are just so all over the place. And most people doing those studies aren't oceanographers. I had the good fortune of working on an oceanography ship where I had to titrate the salinity with iodide and starch solution, and so you could tell the oceanographers because of the starch on our iodide stains on our fingers and stuff. And it turns out that when the ice, so we've gone in the Arctic, we've gone from 2/3 covered with sea ice down to less than a third, and so that's all that open water that's absorbing the heat, absorbing the light. But when it also means come October, when the cold weather returns, you've got twice as much sea ice forming. And when sea ice forms, the ice is fresh and the salt is left behind. So you get this supersaturated, really cold water that's very dense, and so it sinks. And this is what drives the thermohaline circulation of the world's oceans. It gets a little kick from the turning of the world, but then it's this dense waters that are sinking, that are high in salinity and low in temperature. And so in 2011, we saw the Gulf Stream swing up onto the continental shelf, closer to Rhode Island than ever before, and that's an indication of dissipating energy. The Gulf Stream has to squeeze through the Florida Straits, and then it has to dissipate all this energy, so it meanders, it zigzags. And when you see a train crash, you'll see the cars go every which way. So this is an indication that there's more water moving around. And in 2007, Svalbard, which is on the threshold between the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, that used to be the end of the road for the warm Gulf Stream water. And it, in 2007, surfaced and is now causing the glaciers on the land to start melting, adding more fresh water and water to the ocean. And that means that there's more warm water flowing in as midwater below the surface water of the Arctic water, which is again accelerating the sea ice. And so all we can measure, it's easy to measure the sea ice, it's impossible to measure that closely, other than doing the drama of looking at Svalbard and looking at, you know, meandering things, what's going on, but it is accelerating. And there's a number of positive feedback loops that are just, wow. So thank you for all that.
And another thing to mention is sometimes people see graphs like this and they think that these levels of uncertainty mean that we really don't know or that scientists really don't know what they're talking about when it comes to climate change. But these prediction variations aren't because we don't know that climate change is happening or because we don't know that sea level rise is happening. It's because the climate system is so complex, as you were just talking about, that there's really almost no way to tell which one of these will happen. So that's just something to remember. These variations don't mean that the science and data
and
is
leave it
there.
up for a second. This is oversimplified.
Yeah.
You know, because they have these computers, they run all these algorithms, you know, if it's 60% cloudy or if it's 65% or whatever. So they got a whole spew of those. And
Yeah.
the good news is that the worst graph is if people do nothing.
Yeah.
And so nations are doing something, but they're using historical data, and so that sets them on that kind of trajectory.
Yeah, exactly.
But how much lower is anyone's guess?
Yeah.
And obviously, the more we do, the more likely. So it's really an act of faith that the more we can do, the bigger the difference it'll make.
Yeah, exactly. So what we see here, I just put the numerical values for the different estimates of Boston sea level. So the low is 2.36 feet and the high is 6.4 feet of sea level rise in comparison to current sea levels. So basically what this tells us is that no matter what we do, there will be a certain level of sea level rise. And this is again because of what I was talking about, greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a certain period of time. And, you know, for a multitude of reasons, we've put ourselves on a path already that will lead to sea level rise. And this is just a close-up of the high tide flood risks for the city of Cambridge. So this will just give you an idea of the types of places that would be most at risk with any type of sea level rise for the cities of Boston and Cambridge. And if you notice up here, the Fresh Pond area, this isn't directly connected to the Charles River or Boston Harbor or, you know, any sea, but it still will face increased flood risks with sea level rise because of elevation and just like the connectedness of bodies of water.
Right, so you've got over here the Mystic River, going under the Mystic River Bridge.
Yeah.
And then there's the Amelia Earhart Dam. And so above the dam, the water is flat, it isn't flowing. You've got pond lilies growing there and stuff. And so that's, and then you go up the Mystic and you can hang a left on the Alewife. And then the Alewife drains Fresh Pond. So that's how it would come around. And this is frightening because this is like a spring tide today with a favorable wind. That's the flooding. It says, you know, current high tide flood risks for these areas. So all it takes is the perfect storm being, you know, a spring tide, prevailing winds the right direction, and sorry, Charlie, it's
yeah. So this is what we're looking at right now, which is, you know, not insignificant for especially certain portions of Cambridge. And this is the best case scenario with this 2.36 feet of sea level rise. So
this is in 2100 now.
Yeah. So this green section is not necessarily, you know, permanent flooding, but again, flood risk. So I don't know if you can very clearly see the differences, but it looks pretty similar to the high tide flood risk map for today. With just the possibility for some of this flooding to be more permanent. They just don't really know with 2.36 feet of sea level rise what will just be increased flooding and what could be more permanent flooding. But the same areas, you know, the Charles River, Fresh Pond, these areas down here, it's pretty similar, but something to keep in mind for sure, because if you're living in any of these areas, you'll definitely have to deal with more flooding and, you know, the potential for some areas to be completely underwater depending on what happens.
Well, we need to address those. And look at all the yellow on the top. I mean, I see Logan Airport covered, but no, that's not Logan, it's on the right there.
Yeah, so this is
the
Logan.
The squareness up there, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, this is, I'm not
So that's
quite sure what
Chelsea
this
Creek.
is. Chelsea,
Those
yeah.
are where the terminals, the oil tanks are. And I don't know what that is, up in Everett or,
Yeah, Everett. I think that's
Like-
Revere.
Yeah, it could get up to Wonderland tracks and stuff.
Yeah, this I think is the Seaport area, like down here.
Yep,
That'll
exactly.
face
And if you look
flooding
at
as
Fresh
well.
Pond, the cheapest housing in Cambridge, we put next to Fresh Pond, we put in the Ringe Towers and stuff.
Yeah,
And that's the lowest point in Cambridge
yeah,
because of the way that the alewife connects it. And so these poor people, they don't want to live in a flood zone, but that's the only housing you can afford, and so that's why you put them there.
yeah, exactly. So, just even more flood risk for them and for any currently flood-prone areas.
So this comes around to the social justice, environmental justice issues that the wealthy people live on top of the hills, and so they don't have to spend money on protecting the lowlands, and
Yeah.
yet the poor people are stuck in the lowlands, and we need to spend government money on making sure that these floods don't happen.
Yeah, and that's where some mitigation comes in.
Yeah.
Flood mitigation. And we'll talk about that more at the end, but there's different steps that Boston can take and Cambridge can take to mitigate their flood risk that they're looking into pretty seriously right now. Mostly because of the worst case scenario, which is that
Yikes.
these huge parts of Boston, so this is the entire seaport, and Cambridge, so all this area here, and you can see that the flood risk for Fresh Pond increased significantly here.
Oh yeah.
But these blue parts are just completely underwater because of elevation and direct connection to
This is the worst case.
sea.
So it's like
Yeah,
6 foot.
This is the worst case,
6 foot
so
level or
6.5,
something.
almost
6.5.
6.5 feet of sea level
Yeah.
rise. Just massive parts of Boston and Cambridge will be completely underwater and essentially uninhabitable. So, this is kind of what will happen if we do nothing about climate change. If we just, let things continue as they are.
Status quo.
Yeah, the status quo,
Yeah.
or just keep doing what we're doing. Potentially, if things get worse, if we continue to emit more, this is what could happen. Maybe even something worse than this. But this is also assuming that we don't really employ any mitigation strategies.
Right.
Which is pretty unlikely that we wouldn't employ any mitigation strategies at all, but the best way to mitigate sea level rise consequences is to decrease sea level rise. So mitigation strategies that are...
Well, mitigation means what you can do in Boston besides. Right.
Yeah, like infrastructure changes.
Well, wait. Let's step back for a second. Can you show us the best case for with a little sales job here? So
Yeah.
you either have this, or you can have that.
Yes.
And this is going to be destructive.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to be
Sorry,
the
this-
best case. Yeah, the best case is going to be expensive, but that we want to spend money to get this rather than suffer that.
Yeah, exactly. So this will be, and this will also be very expensive for different reasons. You have massive amounts of people that need to be relocated, massive businesses that need to be relocated. If you think about just the amount of businesses that are in the seaport and the amount of biotech companies that are in Cambridge, this isn't insignificant, expense-wise at all. So
They can become fish farmers.
yeah, exactly.
We can employ them as fish farmers. All those IT people who
Yeah,
lost their
exactly. They can
connections.
just go fishing. Which is where we come to what can you do? So there's a lot of stuff that we can do to prevent sea level rise. Particularly, what we can do to prevent sea level rise is decrease emissions and try and lower the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, but a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. So stuff like that individuals can do is, try to use more public transport, less driving, electric vehicles, less waste. So that can be clothing waste, plastic waste, all of that stuff takes up a lot of resources. So if you use less, your carbon footprint will be lower. So
Right, reuse it, then they don't have to manufacture more of it, too.
yeah, exactly. So those are the general steps you can take. In Boston and in Cambridge, what the mitigation steps that we can take are a lot of stuff to do with government infrastructure. So when you think about sea level rise, part of it is how much water will be absorbed. So cities, and particularly coastal cities, where there's high amounts of sea level rise, they have a lot of these slick non-porous surfaces like sidewalks, like concrete sidewalks, asphalt, pavement. All of those things don't really absorb water. They more just sit on top of it.
Yeah.
So when sea levels rise, it'll just sit right on top of the asphalt, and if your sea level is rising 2 feet, that'll just be 2 feet of water on top of asphalt. And
it won't even sit there. It'll be flowing to the lowest points.
Exactly.
So get ready for here comes the floods.
Yeah, exactly. It won't be like, lowering at all. It'll just be more. So when you want to think of like infrastructure, a lot of that involves green infrastructure. So, even like some places are having like green roofs, which is like for increased precipitation. But you can think of like taking a green roof and putting it on the sidewalk. Like these pits.
Well, this is right. The mayor of Boston is doing that. He's mapping out.
Yeah, exactly.
The former mayor and Wu is picking up on it. But,
yeah.
It's just greening the shoreline.
Yeah. If you green the shoreline in like different areas along the coasts, then that's somewhere for the water to go and somewhere for the water to be absorbed. So instead of having 2 feet of direct sea level rise and direct flooding, maybe it'll be less than that, and instead of having that 2 feet of sea level rise just, sit right on top and flow, some of it will be absorbed, so you're lessening the impact on, the people. And just using natural resources, sustainable resources to help mitigate these, effects of climate change and natural disasters.
Yeah, I call it the sponge effect. If we can get the sponges out there, the greater. So if you replace the asphalt with a lawn, then it will absorb the water. 4 inches of soil under a lawn will hold 7 inches of rainwater or flood water.
Yeah.
And then we have more seagrasses and more stuff in the intertidal zone. Seaweeds will reduce the storm surge and flux of that. And you look at the outer coast, but it's all sea level rise. So if we could fill the lower Mystic with seagrasses, leave a channel open, that sponge will help the whole system kind of thing. If we can have, if we could put out bags of oysters off our pier, off the ships that are tied along the pier, that would lessen the storm surge by having some way to absorb the energy as it comes. So let's make hay out of this. Let's see if we can get some more seagrasses going and so forth. So they did a design for. They looked at the Boston Harbor Islands, and they said if there were no harbor islands, what would that do for sea level rise in Boston? And it would increase it significantly. Yeah. And so conversely, what could you do to further diminish it? Because we can't put a wall up, because then the water just comes in over Belle Isle Marsh, or it's going to break through. So, but they found that if you connected 2 islands with a salt marsh, and you did 3 or 4 things, build like an artificial island off of UMass on Columbia Point there, that would, so we have to think creatively and greenly. Yeah. It's really exciting. The Nature Conservancy, the trustees of reservations are working on a pier, a derelict pier in East Boston, and they're going to turn that into a peninsula with tide pools in it and grasses on it, so it'll absorb the energy. They'll keep some of the pilings there to historic reasons, but it won't be a hardened, it will soften the shoreline and be a sponge. Yeah,
so those things are really important and can, pretty significantly change what our coasts will look like, especially with sea level rise. But all of these images were made using the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, so it's a really cool program if people want to look it up. You can go to anywhere in the United States that has a coastline, and you can put in your location, you can look at flood risk, you can look at sea level rise, and you can just scroll. So it goes from, I think, 0 to 10 feet. So you can look at what 0 feet of sea level rise will be, and you can look at what 10 feet of sea level rise will be.
Sophia, I got to thank you. We got 27 seconds left, so I want to thank you for that, and come back to me. And so, thank you. So,
thank you.
Tomorrow we're headed out to Sudbury, where we're going to be at, what's the coffee house?
Sudbury Coffee Works.
Sudbury Coffee Works from 10 to 2. We're going to set up our natural lawns with healthy soils for climate restoration challenge. And we're challenging the people of Sudbury and Lincoln versus Concord Carlisle to have the greatest percentage of households that are pledging not to put fertilizer on their lawns so that they can develop better relationships with the fungi and bacteria and capture more carbon.